Farid Zakaria exclusive.
Hello and welcome. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is set to embark on a historic visit to the United States next week. The US Ambassador to India, Eric Garcetti, described the relationship to me as the world's most critical relationship at the moment. And The Economist magazine, in its latest cover, describes Indo-US ties as the world's most important transaction. To talk about the deepening ties between India and the United States, I'm joined on the news track today by a man who has a deep understanding and love for both India and the US. My guest on India today is one of the world's top foreign affairs gurus, Farid Zakaria. Farid, welcome back. It's always a pleasure.
Always good to talk to you, Rahul.
Thank you so much for taking out time in a very busy schedule. I want to get straight to the point and straight to Prime Minister Narendra Modi's big visit to Washington, D.C. next week. India seems excited. The US seems excited. What are you expecting will emerge from this big state visit, which is only the third state visit of the Biden administration?
So first, that is the symbolism is important. Biden has not had a lot of state visits, and I think he's trying to signal with this one that the Indian relationship is indeed as critical as you were describing. I think the important thing to remember is that this is part of a long train of events at this point that crosses both political parties in the United States and both coalitions in India. So you can think of this as really beginning with the end of the Cold War and Bill Clinton beginning to make overtures to India, but there was still many difficulties. The U.S. was still caught in the kind of anti-proliferation mindset and was viewing India through that, even though Clinton clearly wanted to build ties. After that came the Bush administration, which really made the decisive break and brought India into the fold on the nuclear issue, essentially granting India all the things that India had asked for 30 years. It was a really extraordinary deal negotiated by Manmohan Singh and the Bush administration. Since then, what you have seen is just ever increasing and ever strengthening ties. And I think it's fair to say that in the last 5 years, you have seen another step function rise, which is the strengthening of real defense ties. That is the Quad. That is India's decision to buy more non-Russian equipment, more Western equipment. So I think you are seeing a sea change, but like the metaphor of the sea, these are slow moving, but very powerful forces. And so I suspect you're not going to see one dramatic announcement of any kind. I think what's really happening is a kind of transformation of India's relationship with the US.
The Economist magazine, which has in the past been massively critical of the Indian government and particularly the Prime Minister, in its latest cover calls the Indo-US relationship as the world's most important transaction. Is that what it is? Because India not wanting to come into the purview of the NATO alliance, wanting to stay slightly away from any formal treaty with the US. So is this really a transactional relationship?
No, I didn't like that characterization, and I think it's not accurate. I think, look, there's always been a civilizational attraction between India and the U.S. You can go back to, Nehru coming to the United States during the Truman administration, then the Eisenhower administration, then, of course, the famous visits between Jacqueline Kennedy coming to India and Nehru going to visit John Kennedy. So there have always been this, the idea of the world's most powerful democracy and the world's biggest democracy having a kind of natural alliance. And there are many, many similarities between the two countries. They're both open, diverse, messy, chaotic countries that to a lot of people outside look like they're kind of, too chaotic, and Galbraith used to call India functioning anarchy. I don't think somebody would say quite that about America, but on its bad days, America sometimes looks like functioning anarchy as well. So there's that much deeper tie than a transaction would suggest. But it's true that there has become a practical element. We've now seen a practical element introduced with the rise of China. The rise of China is the single most important geopolitical factor of the last 25 years. And naturally, every country's foreign policy is being reoriented on the basis of that shift. The US has shifted, Europe has shifted, every country in the world has shifted. India naturally is looking at that and asking itself, what does that mean? I think India is trying to find a way to, in a sense, have its cake and eat it too. That is, maintain economic ties with China, which are essential because it needs to grow, and China is the second largest economy in the world, but maintain deeper and deeper political and diplomatic ties. But I suspect that what you will see is the growth of the people-to-people relationship between India and the United States will grow by leaps and bounds and will almost overwhelm everything else. Because these, as you know, India, when you look at the polls, India is one of the most pro-American countries in the world. When you poll Americans, they have very favorable understanding of India. And it's because, I think, of the similarities. So, there's the state-to-state transaction, but, the United States has a state-to-state transaction with Saudi Arabia. There is no love between the two societies. I think there is going to be, between India and America, a deep relationship between the people, not just the government.
You wrote in a recent article that the mood in India seems to be quite different from what you're picking up in Europe and the United States. Could you explain that to our viewers, your sense from your recent visit of how you think India sees India at the moment, now the rest of the world is seeing India?
Broadly speaking, in the United States and Western Europe, there is a great deal of caution. There's a great deal of concern. I'm not even sure I'd call it pessimism, but sometimes it morphs into pessimism about the fact that the changes that are taking place in the world, while they have many extraordinary benefits for America and Europe, most of them originate in America and Europe, the big technological changes like artificial intelligence. But they have the effect of widening inequality in the US, in Europe. They have the effect of creating a more complicated society, one torn apart in some ways between, educated and non-educated, urban and non-urban, the people who are more traditional in their lifestyles and people who are more secular. In India, I think because it is at an earlier stage of development, the changes that have taken place over the last 20 years, globalization, technological changes, have all lifted, I wouldn't say all boats, but lots of boats in India. And so there's a much greater general optimism and embrace of the changes taking place in the world. India is one of the most optimistic countries in the world, I think, because it sees what is happening and it believes that it is producing pretty widespread benefits. They aren't accruing to everyone, and as I've often pointed out, India needs to focus on including those who have not been included, women, Muslims, other minorities. But by and large, there is a general optimism in India that I think is very striking and quite frankly infectious. You come back from India very charged.
What's your assessment of the performance of the Narendra Modi government, especially when you look back at the kind of concerns or views you may have had about the Prime Minister when he started out in government in 2014 and how India has done in the last 9 years? Morgan Stanley in a recent report said that the last 9 years have been transformative and India is set to be the third largest economy in the world by 2027-28. How are you seeing the performance of the Indian government?
Modi's government has done a very good job on the economy. They have done a very good job on the economy in two fundamental ways. One, they've managed things much better than Indian governments have tended to do. There's just better management, less corruption, less drift in some ways. There's a great deal of competence. They have not done as many reforms as I would have liked. Some of that is that they were stymied by them. The agricultural reforms have been doing stuff on land and labor in India is very difficult, and they have not succeeded at that. But what they have been able to do is to competently execute on a number of different fronts, particularly on infrastructure. digital infrastructure and physical infrastructure. So I think those are huge plus points. It's worth pointing out that, this is again part of a longer story. If you look at the average growth rate of the Modi government, it's not that different from the average growth rate of the preceding government. And in fact, to be fair and to give credit where it's due, ever since Rajiv Gandhi, there has been a move toward liberalization, and you have seen growth rates pick up. But for a while, India was very poor. And so when you're going from $300 per capita GDP and you're growing even at 5, 6, 7%, you don't see much. So what has happened is you've had the cumulative effect of 25 years of growth. But as I say, you cannot deny that the Modi government has executed very well. They've done it. I have to confess, I assumed that Modi would be good at this, and he has proved to be good at this because of the experience of Gujarat. On the Hindu nationalist front, I've been disappointed by the fact that the government has not reached out to all Indians. That's unfortunate. I hope it changes. I think it is a reality right now, for example, that the entire ruling coalition in the Lok Sabha, to the best of my knowledge, has not a single Muslim. And there are about 200 million Muslims in India, and so that lack of representation is not. It's not what you'd hope for from the world's biggest democracy. And those areas I have been disappointed, and I hope that the glory of Indian democracy is that nothing stays the same forever. That there is, and you see it, frankly, in UP, there is a change. Even the BJP is reaching out in different ways, and I hope they'll realize that Indians are. I grew up in India. India is remarkably unified in terms of the attitude of its citizens. People want to be Indian first, before caste, creed, religion.
In a recent article, you wrote about how the physical infrastructure in India seems to be changing at a faster pace than ever, and that, in fact, the government would claim is one of their big achievements, because unlike China, India never really spent quite as much in physical infrastructure. And you came back after quite some time, and what did you make of the kind of changes that you're seeing?
I think the infrastructure story is remarkable, and I do think this government deserves a lot of credit for it. It's not, by the way, Rahul, that I came back after a long time. I come to India several times a year. But at some point, you began to realize there was a kind of critical mass that had passed. That there were plans to build a second sea link in Bombay. There were plans, but suddenly you started to see everything happening. And to be fair, a lot of it is state governments. But the key enabling factors have been two things. One, India finally has the money to spend on infrastructure. Again, this was a cumulative effect. Before that, you really didn't have the ability to spend on the scale you needed to. And the second is the competence of the execution of the Modi government, which I give it credit for. Though, as I say, a lot of state governments have stepped in as well. So the whole picture it looks very different than it did before. You can even just see it when I used to go to China. I was always struck by, if you looked out of your window, you would just be able to count construction cranes, and you'd see 20, 25, 30. And you'd go to Bombay and you'd see 5. Now you're beginning to have that same feeling. When you're in the Bandra Kurla area in Bombay, you just see a sea of construction cranes. When you go to Bangalore, you see, huge new projects, unfortunately not helping the road traffic in Bangalore, but a lot of buildings being built. So there's a lot of energy behind that. And I think that you're going to probably see the benefits of it in 5 years. I particularly look at my hometown, Mumbai, and between the subway system that's being built, between the road that's going to hug the coast, between the second sea link, I think you will see a almost transformed Bombay, where the links between the various centers of the city have finally happened. And that could be really a game changer.
Diplomacy, in part, is institutional between India and the United States, and especially under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, it's also been very personal. And Prime Minister Modi and former President Donald Trump shared a very effusive personal relationship. What's your reading of the current chemistry and the dynamic between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden?
I think that Modi is very good at establishing personal relationships with leaders whom he needs to do business with. I don't think it was actually that personal between him and Trump. I doubt very much that he had any great, particularly warm feelings toward Trump. If you recall, he was very good with Obama as well, and gave Obama a grand visit to India. I talked to Obama after it, and he felt that he had established a really very strong personal relationship. Biden knows Modi, and Modi knows Biden, so I suspect it'll be quite good as well. But I think that's one of Modi's skills. He's good at building that personal relationship. Part of what what he has is people see how popular he is in India. That adds a certain kind of political power. Particularly among Democratic politicians. A fellow Democratic politician is always impressed by someone like Modi who can, bring these kind of crowds together in the U.S. and in Australia recently. Trump found that fascinating. Biden will find that fascinating, and Modi's smart. He uses that to his advantage.
Okay. A lot of the focus in this trip seems to be on high-end weapon purchases. There's an announcement yesterday about Predator drones being purchased by the Indian government. Before that, the GE 414 engines, which will be used in the Indian light combat aircraft. Now, one of the things about weapon purchases from Russia was that they were also accompanied by transfer of technology, and one of the concerns in India is, can the United States be trusted as a weapon supplier, or do you think if things were to go wrong, or if India were to take an independent position on some foreign policy matter in the future, that the US may use these weapons as some kind of leverage against the Indian government at that time?
I very much doubt it. The US has made a strategic decision, as I said, over 4 administrations, to shift its policy toward India and to make a very substantial shift towards it. On the nuclear deal, as I said, basically the concessions all came from one side, the US. The US made all the concessions. In fact, there were so many made that the Indians, for a while, there was opposition in India because they were like, why are the Americans making so many concessions? This must be a trap. So I think that there is there's some old non-aligned movement suspicions still linger in India. Look, when you look at the United States' relationship with its allies, and the United States has 59 treaty allies, it has been very consistent. It has been very loyal. It has been very straightforward. People often claim that the U.S. is, mercurial and short-term oriented and can't stay the course. But look at the reality. The United States Army is still on the banks of the Rhine defending Germany. It is still in South Korea, defending that country. It is still in Okinawa, defending that country, 75 years after those commitments were made. What other foreign great power has maintained that level of consistency? And I think that because India has this people-to-people attraction with the U.S., I think it'll be even stronger. I think that the U.S.-India relationship will become like the U.S.-Britain relationship, like the U.S.-Israel relationship. And look, the specific issue you're talking about, this is something India desperately needs. India needs to have cutting-edge weaponry. It needs to be at the forefront of military technology and to have the best systems. India can operate them just fine. It's a very technologically sophisticated country. But what it has right now is, frankly, second-rate Russian equipment. And all you have to do is look at what is happening in Ukraine to see how this Russian equipment is faring. And the warning signs have been around for a while. If you look at the first Gulf War, the M1 Abrams, the American tank versus the Russian tank that Saddam Hussein's army had, there was no match. There was no contest. It was, that was one of the biggest mismatches that has taken place in these situations is when you put American equipment against Russian equipment, the Russian equipment is just not even second tier, it's fourth tier. And it's going to get worse as Russia is deprived of all these technologies because of the sanctions. So this is an area where India actually needs to move and move fast and move in a big way. And all I can say was on the U.S. side is look at how the U.S. has treated its other allies for 75 years.
There's a big general election in India next year, and there's a presidential election in the United States as well. Your sense on both? Is President Biden, who's now indicated that he will seek re-election, likely to get re-elected? Where do you see Donald Trump in the mix at the moment?
It looks like that the Republican Party is caught in a trap. Trump is strong enough to be unbeatable for the Republican nomination. He just has that core of people who are going to back him no matter what. But when it gets to the broader public, what we have seen since 2016 is that there is a working majority that does not like Trump. It's not huge, but if you think of after 2016, the Republicans lost the House of Representatives. Then in 2020, Trump loses re-election by 7.5 million votes to Biden. Then the Republicans lose the Senate. And in the recent midterm election, they did worse than almost every historical model would have predicted. So what you're seeing is that there is a small but steady majority of Americans who just don't like Trump. And yes, he won in 2016, but as I say, put that up against the subsequent 6 years, and you've just seen a record of failure. So my guess is that Trump gets the nomination and loses the election. It's a long way away, and I'm hesitant to make predictions because I always feel like you ask for straight answers, and that's my best guess at the time. Now, many things can happen. The economy can go into a free fall. Biden could have a big health episode. If any of those things happen, things can change. The truth about America right now is these things are very evenly balanced. So even when I say there's a comfortable majority, I mean 51-49 or 52-48. Nobody is getting the kind of blowout victories that used to happen 25 or 30 years ago.
You spoke of Russia. And how much of an irritant is it in the United States and for the Biden administration and in the both houses of Congress and Senate, India continuing to maintain its ties with Russia, continuing to get oil, continuing to trade, continuing to rely on Russia for weapon purchases, or at least servicing old weapon systems that have been bought from the US? Is that question fully solved, and does it lie at rest, or is that still a simmering discontent?
The United States has decided to meet India where it is. So I don't get the sense that the U.S. policymakers spend a lot of time worrying about some of these issues. There are irritants from time to time. By the way, on the oil issue, the U.S. understands that India has to buy oil from Russia. That is not a major irritant. In fact, the whole nature and design of the sanctions against Russia are designed to allow it to sell its oil, just at a reduced price, so that Russian revenues get depressed. But if Russia's oil was taken off the market entirely, oil would go to $200 a barrel because there would be that much reduction of supply. So, and the United States understands this. So they know that Russian oil has to flow. They just want it to flow in a way that minimizes revenues to Putin. That's what they've achieved through the price cap, which forces Russia to sell oil to India at a discount, which is good for India and is good for the U.S. I think that the real issue is, does India want to make its own broader strategic decision to have a stronger and closer and more durable alliance with America, and to gain all the benefits that could come from that, especially in terms of technology, in terms of deepening the technological ties, the technological transfers, deepening the economic relationship. I think it's enormously in India's benefit. India benefits much more than the U.S. because India is a poorer country. India needs the technology. India needs the advanced weapons. India needs those, the U.S. market more than the other way around. the U.S. needs India from a strategic point of view, but I think let's put it at least this way: there are mutual benefits. So both sides should consider it in those terms. I do think India is a little too hung up on, the non-aligned past, some of this historical relationship with Russia. The Russians haven't delivered much for the Indians. I mean, they veto things in the Security Council, but the U.S. has not pressed the Kashmir issue for 20 years in the Security Council. So that, these are, again, I think a lot of what's going on here is the shadow of the past is inhibiting a move toward the future. And the reality is most Indians would be much more comfortable with a close relationship with America than a close relationship with Russia or China. I mean, India, as you know, Rahul, I mean, if you look around, you walk around India, it is America that they think about, look to, the Indian businessmen want to do business with India. Indian students want to go to America to study. Indian NGOs look to America as the standard for, how they should operate. So there's a real connection between these two countries. I very much hope that it builds.
India is the president of the G20 this year. One of the irritants in the foreign ministers meeting was the Russia-Ukraine war, because of which the G20 couldn't come to an understanding on the wording of the joint statement. Where do you see the Russia-Ukraine war go from here? Ukraine seems to have started some kind of a counter-offensive. How successful is that likely to be? Where do you see the next few months take the Russia-Ukraine war?
I think where we are with that war is that neither side has the capacity to win totally and decisively, but neither side is so weak that they will accept, a kind of some kind of humiliating peace deal. What that means is the war will continue. Both sides will fight. I think that the Ukrainians will surprise, as they always have, with their courage, with their discipline, with their military prowess. But Russia is, Russia is in some ways 3, 4, 5 times bigger. If you looked at the original defense budgets, it was 10 times bigger. So Russia has enough strength that it can stay in the game. There's a possibility it collapses, by the way. I don't think there's any possibility Ukraine will collapse, but there's a possibility Russia collapses. In any event, I think Russia is out of the international system for a long time. The sanctions will stay on because there isn't going to be a happy peace deal, right? Neither side is going to accept the terms that the other will offer. What that means is this continues. This probably ends the way the Korean War ended. Both sides stop fighting in Korea and you have an armistice, not a peace deal. That's why you have a DMZ, the demilitarized zone, because it's actually technically still an active war. That's more likely to be the scenario. So Russia remains isolated, Russia remains sanctioned, Russia will be denied the technologies it needs. But it's inconceivable to me that Ukraine will give in. Look, once a country decides it wants to be free and independent, the record of the 20th century is very clear. What Russia is trying to do is very similar to what France tried to do in Algeria. The French believed that their great powerdom came from Algeria, and they had to hold on to Algeria. And they held on to it even though 4 governments fell. They killed 1 million Algerians from the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. Algeria still got its independence. Russia could kill 1 million Ukrainians. Ukraine will still insist on being a free and independent country. When you're up against that kind of national independence and pride and sentiment, Russia cannot win.
Linked to the question of Russia is the question of China, which is irritant not just for India but also for the United States. Anthony Blinken is to go to Beijing soon. How do you see United States' relationship with China evolve from here? A lot of the focus now seems to be on de-risking rather than decoupling.
Yeah, very well put, Rahul. I think that basically what the United States is trying to figure out is how to construct a relationship with China that recognizes that there are very important differences, very important areas of conflict, policies that the United States has had to put in place either to deter China in certain ways from certain kinds of actions, or to respond to things China has done on the trade front, where it has in many ways violated free trade and WTO principles, but at the same time maintain overall stability, equilibrium, and not move towards some kind of, Cold War or hot war. So it's a tricky balance, right? Because you are trying to keep a working relationship and an engaged relationship, but you have to do things that the Chinese are protesting about, understandably from their point of view. The way I would put it from the American point of view, the United States has had to do certain things. For example, the chip ban, to make sure that the Chinese military does not have the very highest level technology, which it would then deploy in possible situations against the West and its allies. So it has had to do that. That annoyed the Chinese enormously, and that has caused the Chinese to push back. And so the U.S. has to find a way to do these things that it has to do, but try to maintain a good working relationship and explain to China there is no desire for conflict, there's no desire for war, there's not even a desire for a total decoupling of the relationship. U.S. and China still have a $700 billion trade relationship. I mean, it's huge. So even when you look at the chip area, the U.S. has banned the very highest end chips. That's about 5% of the market. 95% of the market is open, globalized, and by the way, the U.S. buys many of its chips from China. China buys huge amounts of agricultural goods from America. The administration is trying to signal with these new moves that you rightly point to that, look, we want to have communication, we want to have dialogue, we want to have contact, we want to have cooperation, we want to have economic ties. We just have certain areas where we have to cordon off and we have to deter, and we're not going to be shy about doing those. So those are the terms of the deal, and I think the Chinese will over time recognize that is, that it's not the world they were in 10 years ago, but China is different than it was 10 years ago. China was that China, which was not Xi Jinping's China, was much more cooperative, much more willing to try to integrate into the world, much less hostile to its neighbors, wasn't doing the kind of things in the Himalayas that it did, right? So the world has naturally taken note and is responding and reacting, but there's no desire for war.
Twice in the recent past, President Xi Jinping in public addresses has spoken of extreme conditions. He said we must be prepared for worst case and extreme scenarios, be ready to withstand the major test of high winds, choppy waters, even dangerous storms. A week later, he extended that concept to the economic arena. He was in Mongolia where he said something like ensuring normal operation of the national economy under extreme circumstances. What's he alluding to? What could be going on in his head?
I love the way that the Chinese always have these metaphors where you're supposed to kind of read the tea leaves and understand what they're saying. I think it's mostly directed towards this concern. Something happens in Taiwan. The United States and its allies, at the very least, impose very real sanctions on China. Perhaps there's much more. There's military assistance to Taiwan. How would China have to react in that circumstance? Some people told me that one of the reasons they did the Shanghai lockdown was that they were trying to do, during COVID, they were trying to see how resilient they could make a city's economy under conditions of clampdown. So it was almost like they were doing a test case of a sanctions regime against a part of China. They are obviously concerned about that. They are preparing for it. I don't view that as meaning that there is a concern about some kind of general war between the U.S. and China. But Taiwan is a real issue, and it's becoming a real issue largely because of the Taiwanese people. You see, until recently, the Chinese believed that time was on their side. Over time, the Chinese economy is so huge, and 1.4 billion Chinese and 22 million Taiwanese on the other side of the strait. The magnet would pull Taiwan. What is happening, in fact, is Taiwan is becoming a very fiercely democratic, independent culture. And they are very clear that they want to maintain their democracy. And they know that any kind of association with China means what happened to Hong Kong will happen to them. That's China's problem. It's not actually the U.S. It's what's going on inside Taiwan. But it's true, it has this geopolitical dimension, which is the U.S. has an alliance with Taiwan, and it has a relationship with Taiwan. It has legislation, the Taiwan Relations Act, which says it will support Taiwan. So Xi Jinping is understandably concerned. But
so will President Xi make a go for Taiwan, or on the back of what we've seen between Russia and Ukraine, and given how long that war has gone on? Or do you think this is more about muscle flexing than any real attempt to take over the Straits and the Taiwanese island?
I think it's muscle flexing. I think that the Chinese are, in general, more strategic than the Russians. They know that this would be a war that would cause enormous damage to the main project which China has, which is modernizing the Chinese economy, becoming a high income country by 2050. They've always said that was their North Star. That was what they were driving towards. And they must realize that an invasion of Taiwan would seriously derail it, because it would mean probably the end of the kind of globalization we have. That would then lead to a decoupling of the U.S. China relationship. And I think Europe would find it very hard to maintain ties with China, even though they say that they want to have a different relationship and all that. If there were an outright invasion of Taiwan, I think it would be hard. So the Chinese would be, look, I think that what the Chinese are looking for is a kind of coercive diplomacy, not an invasion. Even in their war planning scenarios, if you look at what they do, they practice blockades more than they do outright invasions. And what they're hoping for is to intimidate the Taiwanese into accepting certain kinds of a relationship of deference towards the mainland. And one of the two parties in political parties in Taiwan is more amenable to that. So I think that there is a strategy here that is it's not a binary thing. It's not do nothing or invade. It's much more likely to be some kind of soft pressure. And how the Taiwanese react, again, let's not forget in all of this that, as with Ukraine, we forgot about the Ukrainians and what they would be willing to accept. And everyone says the U.S. should not have expanded NATO. What about the Ukrainians? They did not want to be part of the Russian Empire. That's really what's causing this. And similarly, the Taiwanese will be the most important actors.
This month saw the third anniversary of the Galwan clashes between the Indian Army and the People's Liberation Army. Where do you see India-China ties go from here? Prime Minister Modi will visit the US in this high-profile visit, which will suggest to many in Beijing that India, regardless of what it is saying, is actually coming under America's strategic embrace. Secondly, we've got a very active border between India and China. Even at this moment, a lot of the positions which were filled temporarily have now been deeply entrenched, and the armed forces of both India and China seem locked in eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation in many sectors in Ladakh, going all the way up to Arunachal Pradesh.
I think the Indo-China relationship is a perfect illustration of the failure of China's foreign policy in the last 10 years under Xi Jinping. If you think about it, for 20 years, Deng Xiaoping practiced this masterful foreign policy of, hide your light under a bushel, as they called it. China modernized without scaring people. It rose in the international system from 1% of global GDP to 10 to 15%, and everyone was welcoming it in. And then Xi Jinping comes into power and begins this wolf warrior diplomacy. And it scares the hell out of the Australians. It scares the Japanese. It scares the Vietnamese. It scares the Philippines, all of whom start making overtures in various ways to the United States. And the most important one that China has mishandled has been India. I still don't think anyone understands, I certainly don't, what China thought it was going to gain from those those glaciers in the Himalayas that it was contesting. But it's worth noting that China has always had a very tough attitude towards that border. It has always China has in some ways resolved 15 of its 16 border disputes around its neighbors. The one it has not resolved is the Indian border. And I've always suspected that has something to do with their feeling about Tibet and, Tibetan independence, and fears that this, that creates an idea that there is a a greater Tibet. Don't forget India allowed the Dalai Lama to come to India when he fled China in the 50s. So there's something going on there where the Chinese have a neuralgic attitude towards it, because otherwise it makes no sense. India, as you know, has not been particularly anti-China. And Nehru made all these overtures to China, and then they rebuffed them, eventually invading in 62. Even after that, it did not turn Indian attitudes permanently. India mostly doesn't think a lot about China until recently. And all the time when I was growing up, it wasn't as though Indians didn't have much of a feeling one way or the other. But the Chinese, by making this border so hot, and and being so unyielding on it, have, I think, created a problem that mostly didn't exist. The status quo was one that India was comfortable with. So I think that this is a perfect example of where she's, kind of aggressive diplomacy has led him. He has dialed back in some places, Australia. I don't see much dialing back in India.
Because President Xi Jinping is expected to come to India in September for the G20 summit. Is there a possibility that some of the border tensions could dissipate before that? There could be some disengagement, de-escalation between the Chinese army and the Indian armies, because he will be face to face with our Prime Minister. The SCO summit happens virtually, but the G20 summit will have all these world leaders coming into India. Does that throw open a window of opportunity for tensions to be dialed back? Would that be important from Xi's prism, according to you?
Yeah, I think that that would be very Chinese to try to lessen the tensions at the time when the meeting is going to happen. India should take advantage of it. Look, India needs straight ties with China. It should pursue those. But I think that there is something there with the way that the Chinese view India and that border, which, as I say, is different from the way they view other countries.
Try and build on that. Explain. How do you see that being different? How do you think Beijing views the border with India and the relationship with India at this time, given the fact that it now seems pretty certain that at the current rate of growth by 2027-28, India is likely to be the third largest economy in the world?
So now we're totally speculating, but I've always wondered whether the Chinese view India as their real threat. China views Japan as this offshoot of Sinic civilization, not a kind of a junior partner. It views Korea. These countries are small. The only real civilizational competition to China in Asia is India. India is vast. It's complex. It's dynamic. It has a rich ancient civilization that goes back as far as China's civilization does. So I've always thought that maybe for the Chinese, there cannot be both India and China cannot be dominant in Asia. That one would be dominant and one would have to play a subordinate role. And China does not want to play that subordinate role. With all the others, I think it believes that it will very comfortably dominate. It will comfortably be the sun around which all the other planets orbiting. And that, yes, Japan is troublesome now, but 20, 50 years from now, Japan's, population will be down, its strength will be down. The other countries, very few of them have even a population over 200 million. India is in a different league. So I think that's how the Chinese view India. As I say, my own sense, and you tell me if you disagree, India has not mostly thought very much about China. India
but that's changed. Post Galwan, that's changed a lot. Now China is India's #1 preoccupation, and Pakistan no longer is. And the great thing is, because of COVID, a lot of companies seem to be now thinking of moving away from China in a China +1 diversification of supply chain strategy, and India could potentially be one of the beneficiaries of that. And I'm keen to know what you think of it, because India at this moment is obsessed with China. Pakistan is an afterthought. I haven't in 40 minutes of this interview even asked a single question on Pakistan so far.
Well, I think it's for good reason. India has grown up. India is now a great power. Pakistan is a minor irritant. I frankly think that there would be easy ways to solve the Pakistan issue, but just because the Indians don't India doesn't need to worry about Pakistan anymore. The only country that can really do serious harm to India now is China. On the China plus one side, yes, it's a huge thing that's going on, but India has not yet taken as much advantage of it as it could. The biggest beneficiaries of the plus one strategy so far have been Vietnam and Mexico. I'm talking about the numbers. India has not benefited so much. And that's, India still has a lot of things. It's still very protectionist. It's still highly regulated. It's still unfriendly to foreign businesses. All these things have improved. But when you're not competing against your past in today's world. You're competing against other countries present.
But are you seeing that change? We saw Tim Cook in India recently saying all kinds of glowing things about the Indian economy. Part of it is because of the market. We're also seeing a lot of semiconductor companies wanting to come and invest in India. So part of it is what the government is doing and where India is, and part of it could just be because companies need to look beyond China, and India there provides the biggest possible market.
Correct. India has huge advantages on scale. And so people like Tim Cook honestly have no option but to look at India seriously. I can tell you privately, they all feel that India is over-regulated and not friendly enough to foreign business. And, it's much easier to do business in China, but much easier also to do business in Vietnam. So, and Tim Cook, frankly, Apple will be offered some special deals because it is the symbolic value of having Apple would be so great. What India needs to do is just make itself more business friendly, more, fewer regulators. It'd be good for India. It'd be good for Indian businesses. It'd be good for the economy. It would boost growth. So I think that, a lot has happened. But, when you look at the World Bank's ease of doing business index, India doesn't score so well on that. And that should be one of the goals. And I think it is of the Modi government to try and keep moving up on that.
Farid Zakaria, you've given us a glimpse of the depth and breadth of your understanding of contemporary affairs. I could go on, but you've got a very important interview to prepare for, and I wish you all the very best for that. Do check Farid's big scoop coming up over the next few days, and we'll miss you in DC. It would have been good to catch up in person, but thank you very much for agreeing to give us time and joining us with all your insights, Farid Zakaria.
Always a pleasure, Rahul.
Thank you so much, and best wishes. Thank you.
Where the software engineer meets the smart market analyst, meets the talented photographer to create the big dream. The world comes together at Sharda University. So where are you?
The most credible ranking of India's best B schools is back in an all-new avatar, bigger and better than before. Catch the 2023 listings of MBA programs, technology companies, and the top executive courses. Don't miss the 24th edition of the Business Today Best B Schools and HR Summit on 23rd June in New Delhi.
Quality today. In Delhi, 99. In Mumbai, 66. In Kolkata, 114. In Bangalore, 44. In Chennai, 110. In Hyderabad, 68.
Coastal areas flooded, trees uprooted, power outages. Gujarat is reeling under the aftermath of Cyclone Biparjoy. While there have been no reports of death or massive damage, rescue and relief teams are racing against time to ensure life returns to normal as soon as possible.
This is what the situation is at ground zero. In fact, there are many people who are still stranded in the low-lying areas, and this is totally inundated, totally submerged. In fact, many had apprehension that there is often waterlogging during the flood season. Sometimes it happens, but they did not expect this kind of furious situation. It will potentially bring by the, will be brought by the cyclone. So all you see this entire area, there are certain vehicles which are submerged. In fact, many people who stuck here. If I could just take a pan camera to the other side, there are a few families who are still stuck here and they need to be rescued immediately. They need to be taken to the safer places. And of course, because there are most of the toddlers, the children, they cannot cross through this water level. And this is not just a stagnant water. One side from it's flowing and it is flowing towards the other side. So it has a huge current with it. This is literally like a wave-like situation. There you see the people who are stuck in the low-lying areas. In fact, there is no electricity. All they have is limited stock to survive until unless this water recedes and until unless there is a restoring of the normalcy.
This is where we wrap up the news track tonight. We'll be tracking Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to the United States all through the week. Next week, join my colleagues Shweta Singh, Geeta Mohan and I as we bring you all the latest on the Prime Minister's big visit starting Monday all across India today and Aaj Tak. Thank you for your time and your trust, and see us in New York and Washington DC next week. Goodbye. Good night.
These lethal long-endurance, medium-altitude drones may soon be the new weapons in the arsenal of the Indian Armed Forces. The Defence Acquisition Council on Thursday gave its nod for the acquisition of the Sea Guardian drones. The Army, the Navy